So I'll take heart, Lassa, in the fact that utility, it's just a number, right? So whether it's negative or positive, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just an ordering. So when you said disutility, what you really meant was the utility isn't as high as usual. It's usually very, very high. At 9 in the morning, it's only very high. That's all good. All right, it is 9 o'clock. You're welcome, everyone, for starting at 9 rather than 8. It's also nice for me. But anyway, I was actually listening to a podcast this morning, and they had, yeah, exactly. So they asked a good question. It was actually Paul Krugman talking to Ezra Klein on the New York Times. And they talked about an interesting thing. I thought it'd be fun to pose that first before we do our Kahoot today. So my question is, should the government be involved in innovation, or should that be left to the private sector? What do you think?
Didn't we just find out from the model that the government should be involved because the private sector doesn't
Go ahead,
do it optimally?
Kari. Can't hear you, unfortunately.
You can't hear me? It's okay.
I can hear you.
All right. Kai?
What?
Kari, I couldn't hear you, unfortunately. I saw you unmuted. So should the government be involved in innovation, or should it just be left to the private sector? What do you think?
You think that he
Oh, wait, I can't hear anyone. This is my problem. Hold on a second. It's my headphones. Let me change my sound settings. It's my bad. Hold on 1 second. I apologize for that. I changed my headphones recently, and I bet it's not giving me the right sound setting. Hold on. Yes, that was incorrect. My bad. I'm sorry about that. Let's see here. I think I changed it on Zoom. Audio settings. Yeah, that was the problem. Let's try this one. All right, say something.
Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can, Kai. Sorry about that. Maybe let's take it in turns. I think actually Kari was first and I didn't hear it. Sorry.
Yeah.
So maybe Kari, do you want to say what you were going to say?
I just said we did learn from the model that the government should be involved because the market doesn't allocate the optimal amount. But I mean, that's a stupid model in a stupid world where,
that's true.
It's just two products.
So how about in the real world?
Yeah, I still think so. But that's just because, I don't know, they don't have to incentive in a way, but they can have like a strong safety net to grab people that fail in innovation and, have debt forgiveness easy so that people can start a new business and try again and,
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, I actually misunderstood your first comment, but you're saying that that in the model we find out that the decentralized equilibrium actually is not efficient, right? Yeah, I agree. So the government could actually have policies that would increase growth, say, or make the economy more efficient. Okay, yeah. Kai, did you want to add something?
No, I just unmuted to tell Kari that we could hear him because you said we couldn't hear him.
Okay. So yeah, I like that. I like that comment. So, in our stupid, silly model, then, it looks like the government has a role. In the real world, maybe there should be a social safety net to protect people who innovate, and then, things don't go as well as they think. Okay. Anybody else have any idea? Do you think it should be, government should have a role in innovation?
I think it's kind of weird that we talk about innovation as like one thing because it happens on a differentiated level, right? There's like the innovation that happens at universities, which is much more explorative. And then there's like the implementation part and incremental innovation that we see from companies much more. So maybe there's like a role for both the private and the public sphere in terms of what they want to achieve.
Yeah, sounds reasonable. Anybody else? I'm gonna ask this question now and just kind of get some comments, and then we're gonna talk about it again after the Kahoot. Anybody else think the government? Anybody want to take the other side that maybe the government shouldn't play a role in innovation? That should be completely left up to the market? Usually we have.
I mean, the government does nothing correct, so I mean, it shouldn't have its hand in anything. People should be the ruling party.
Yeah, usually we actually get a fair number of libertarians. We're a business school, so so often we have some people that have strong beliefs about the role of government in society, but apparently not this morning. I mean, we only have only a few of you are here anyway.
I mean, aren't we in Denmark, the most socialist country in the world?
We are in Denmark. That is true, the most socialist country in the world. But you'd be surprised at CPS, you get a different type of Dane. There are those, there is actually the libertarian or the liberal party. I forget what they're called, but
Liberal Alliance.
Yeah, the Liberal Alliance. Thank you. Yeah, they're pretty libertarian, at least in their philosophy, if not in their policy. Okay, well, let's leave it there, and then we'll come back to this after the Kahoot, because I have a little more to say about it, but I thought it'd be fun to talk about it first. And I'll tell you what Paul Krugman said as well. Alrighty, so let me share my screen first. So I actually didn't have a Kahoot on the Romer growth model, the endogenous growth model, so I made one yesterday. So you are the first people. What do you guys see right now?
We just see your screen.
Yeah, but which screen? Do you see the Kahoot?
Now? Yeah, that one.
This one, okay. Alrighty, let's see here.
I think you're screwing it up. Now you're showing us your
Now you're showing the other one, yeah.
Okay.
That is the right one.
Cool. Okie doke. So let's do this. By the way, I was told by my colleague that the right way to do this is actually not to record these question and answer sessions, because she said that then you get a lot more attendance. I'm noticing there's only 14 people here today. Read is good. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We actually have 13 students. 12. This is one more student. Going. All right, here we go. We'll see how it works. In the Romer model, which of the following has market power? The R&D sector, the intermediate sector, the final sector, or the export sector? I guess formally firms in these sectors. Yes, it is the intermediate sector, and there's not much more to say about that, but as you recall, we have differentiated intermediate goods that are sort of bundled together into this final good, and the final good is just sold at cost. So the final sector doesn't have any sort of market power. The differentiated intermediate goods, each producer has a monopoly on their own good. So they actually have market power of their own intermediate good. And then in the R&D sector, they just pay cost. These intermediate good producers just pay cost to get an idea. So there's no market power in the R&D sector either. Okay, so this is not like this isn't an important thing. This is just the way that the model is set up. Yeah, in the way it's set up, the intermediate good sector has the market power. Any questions about that? I can see that there was some debate. It's just the intermediate goods are the ones that are differentiated. Okay, so that's where we're going to have this monopoly power. Each intermediate good producer makes their own good that's different than what everybody else is making. If we make intermediates better substitutes in production, what happens to the market power in the intermediate goods sector? Does it go up? Does it go down? Indeterminate, no change? Maybe I can pull up the slides here. Okay, it goes down, that's right. So maybe I'll just show you something here. So you can see that the final good producers, they have this production function where it's like they use each of the intermediate goods a little bit, and then sort of the substitutability of the intermediate goods is governed by this phi. Okay, so the way this works is that when the goods are more substitutable, these individual intermediate good producers, they can't charge as high of a price, right? Because it's like, suppose we're thinking about, it's easier I often think about these sort of models when you're thinking about, say, cars. Okay, so, cars are like, they're differentiated, right? Some people just want to have an SUV and they don't care about the brand, or it could be any SUV. Some people, they really want to have this particular brand of SUV. So, for some people, it's like it's very easy for them to change between brands based on which one is cheaper. For some people, it's like they really want to buy the brand they want to buy, regardless of the price. Okay, so if that's the case, that they're going to buy that brand regardless of the price, that means that the producer can really charge that person a high amount. Okay, so generally, when the substitutability between goods is high, then the ability of these producers to charge a high markup they don't have the ability to charge a high markup. Because if they charge a high price, then the buyer is just going to switch to a cheaper good. If the goods are not substitutable, then they can really charge a high price. Okay, that's kind of the explanation here. How long does an intermediate firm retain monopoly rights in our model? Monopoly over their production of their own good. Yeah, it's forever, right? So if you are producing an intermediate good, you get to kind of be the only one that can produce that intermediate good forever in our model. You always have the right to produce that good. Okay, and there are monopoly rights because we're assuming that only one producer has the right to produce one of the goods. That's kind of how this model works, right? So the intermediate good producer, they're going to sort of buy a new good from the R&D sector, and then from then until forever, they're going to be the only intermediate good producer that can produce that one good. That's going to give them this monopoly rents. And then that's going to kind of justify their paying for the good in the first place. By the way, for the pictures, they don't have anything to do with the questions. I just took the first business picture that they suggested in Zoom or in Kahoot. Ooh, greed is good. It overtakes upgraded Jenkins. Why do flow profits to intermediate producers fall over time in this model? Is it that old intermediates are less useful, depreciation of capital, falling consumer welfare, or competition from new intermediates? I worded two of those in a way that I slightly regret now. Yeah, so 8 is so competition from new intermediates is the answer I was looking for. What happens is over time, this A is growing. So there's more and more intermediate goods, okay? So there's sort of that competition means that each individual intermediate good is sort of less important in the production, which is why I slightly regret the wording of the first question, which is old intermediates are less useful. I see how you could interpret this as saying that, sort of the marginal value of each old intermediate is less useful because there's more options now. I mean, I guess it's not formally true since the nature of the intermediate good hasn't changed. It's just that now there's sort of more options. So, there's nothing about the nature of the good that has changed. But I can see how you could put triangle. I mean, this was worded in a slightly awkward way. If this were an exam, I probably would have given credit for both of these answers. So, any questions about that? How are growth and market power related in the model? So that's economic growth and market power. Are they positively correlated, negatively correlated, indeterminate, or uncorrelated? Yeah, they're positively correlated. And I'll show you the place on the slides where that is. Let's see here. We actually want to go down to where we solve for LA. Okay. Yeah, so here's the ultimate growth rate, okay? And market power in this model, it's going to be related to this phi. Now, how is it related to phi? I guess the larger is phi. Let's see here. Yeah, this should go to 0, right? So exactly. So the larger is phi. It means the less market power there is. How can we see that? Let's go up to the definition of phi. Okay, here, this is the right place to look. Phi is the markup, okay? So let's see here. Exactly. So phi is like the 1 over phi is the markup. So this means that the larger is phi, the less market power we have, okay? And then down here, you see that as phi gets close to 1, then the growth rate here is getting close to 0. Is that right? Yeah, exactly. As phi gets close to 1, as phi approaches 1, the growth rate is getting close to 0, which means that when firms have less market power, the growth rate is slower. Now, isn't that interesting? If you hadn't realized that part of the model, that's actually a really interesting part of the model. This says that the more monopoly power we give to the firms, the faster is the growth rate. And it says that the more close we are to a perfect competition, the slower is the growth rate, up to the point where if we actually have perfect competition. That's where phi is equal to 1 and there's no markup. So there's firms are just charging marginal cost. Let me just zoom up here a couple of slides and show you again. So again, this is the profits of the firm, the flow profits. So WT divided by phi, that's what the firms are charging. WT is what they're paying to the workers, right? So if phi is equal to 1, then the firms are just charging exactly the same as what they're paying. That's perfect competition. And in fact, their flow profits will be 0. So if that's the case, there is actually no economic growth. Growth disappears if we go to a world with perfect competition. Now that's kind of interesting, isn't it? If you kind of think about what you've learned in other classes, monopoly power is bad, competition is very important. A role of a regulator is to prevent there from being too much monopoly power. We want to make markets as competitive as possible. Well, look at this. Look what we're seeing here. In this model, if we don't have monopoly power, we don't have growth. The economy stagnates without monopoly power. Anybody want to venture why that is? Guess about why that? Guess, comment about why that is in this model.
Well, we have constant population, and if the only people who can invest in knowledge is the private sector, then I guess we get this result. But I think we could easily fix this by saying the government can just become the intermediate producer at, socially optimal levels with no profits. Wouldn't that be a way to rectify it and make it better? In theory, at least.
I mean, yeah, I think it would. I think you're right. I mean, so here the social planner knows everything. I mean, the social planner here can actually can even do better than the decentralized equilibrium period, right? Even with this monopoly power, we're not doing as well as we could be because, we've got this result in the slides coming down here. Is the equilibrium efficient? And it turns out that, where are we here? So the utility maximizing level of allocation in the economy is different than the market allocation between R&D and R&D workers and production workers. And in fact, it turns out that there's more R&D production in the government's allocation. So the government wants even faster growth than in the market allocation. So you're not wrong that here the market can, the all-knowing social planner can do, quote, better than the decentralized market equilibrium, even with monopoly power. So that's not wrong. So I mean, I'm agreeing with your comment, but I guess what I'm saying is that, maybe what I'm asking is a slightly different question, which is, why is it that the economy with market power has faster growth than another economy where there's no market power? Like, what's the intuition there? I mean, we can see the math, but what's the intuition? Why do we need market power here in order to get growth?
The incentives to innovate. Because if you have no market power, then you have no incentive to go and enter into the innovation market, and then we stagnate.
Yeah, that's basically it, right? So I mean, the idea would be the only reason that there's growth in these models is because this A is increasing, right? The number of intermediate goods is expanding. And the only reason why the number of intermediate goods is expanding is that firms find it profitable. So, we have somewhere this firm's choice here. The firm's choice between, decision to invest. This on the right-hand side here is their flow profits from now until forever, discounted, of course. On the left-hand side is the cost of buying an idea from the R&D sector. So basically, the firm, if this is 0 forever, it will never justify paying anything to the R&D sector. Okay, so so the idea is if there's perfect competition, no one will ever want to buy anything from the R&D sector, in which case the R&D sector has no reason to produce anything. There's no demand, so there's no supply. So there won't be any growth. And I bet down here, can we see it? Oh, that's interesting. I was going to say that, oh yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so take a look down here actually at this, this equation. So this is telling you what the market's allocation of research workers is. So you recall that the population in this model is fixed. Okay, so it's split between workers working in the R&D sector, guys doing this stuff up here, and then workers working in the production sector, which is basically making the intermediate goods. Okay, so that's the split of how the resources in the economy are used. And I was suspecting that if we let this phi go to 1, which means that firms lose all of their market power, then we won't have anybody allocated to the innovation sector because no R&D, there's no new R&D that's being produced, no new intermediate goods. So I looked at this and I was a little bit confused because you can see that this first term will go away. If we let phi go to 1, this first term goes away. But the second term here, it doesn't. But it's got a negative sign. So I remember that there's actually a slight, I'm being a little bit hand wavy. And if you look in the book, you actually say that the allocation of R&D workers is the maximum between this and 0, because this you can't allocate less than 0 workers. So yeah. So anyway, it is true that when phi goes to 1, we're actually not going to have any production workers. And in fact, even if phi is a little bit more or a little bit less than 1, we still won't have production workers for the same intuition I just said over here, which is that the flow profits, the discounted lifetime flow profits, have to be at least as high as this left-hand side. And there's some minimum, I guess, for how low this left-hand side can go because of the production side of the economy. That must be what's going on here. But anyway, yeah, so that's the intuition. You have to somehow compensate people for the fact that it's costly to produce new ideas. If there's perfect competition, you don't make any profits from a new intermediate good, a new idea. So why would you go to the trouble of actually inventing one, which is costly? Okay. So I think I'm actually jumping a bit ahead here in the Kahoot, because I think I might have a question about that now everybody's going to get correct. But any questions about that before I move on? Okay. In a standard monopoly model, how is market power related to consumer surplus? See, I should have waited to talk about these. Positively correlated, negatively correlated, indeterminate, uncorrelated. Yeah, it's negatively correlated, right? When monopolies have more power, they typically choose a price level that's higher than what is socially efficient in the sense of maximizing consumer surplus, actually. Well, yeah, of making marginal costs equal to marginal costs equal to the price, right? So that's like sort of the surplus maximizing, not consumer surplus, but both consumer and producer surplus maximizing level of production. So monopolists charge a price that's, quote, too high. So yeah, that's where you get this result from. What is the real world institution which grants market power? The Federal Reserve Board, corporate tax breaks, patent office, or lobbying? Again, slightly wish I would have slightly reworded that, because I think you could argue that lobbying also grants market power, but yeah, patent office, that is correct. Patents basically grant market power. Aside from market power, what feature of patents is in the model? Limited time horizon, blueprints available to public, costly to file for a new patent, or inventors make a profit? Inventors make a profit, yeah. All right, this was a bit tricky, right? But blueprints are available to the public is what I was looking for. In the model, the more ideas there are, just to flip quickly back to the slides, the more ideas there are AT, the cheaper it is in a resource sense to make a new idea, right? Because what you need is L. So instead of W, put L here divided by BAT. That's what it takes to make a new idea. So the more ideas there are, the easier it gets to make a new idea. That's sort of embodying this idea that that the blueprints are available to the public. So you can use the blueprint to make a new idea is the idea here. Now I can see here that you might want to say, I can see why you would have said costly to file for a new patent, since in this model, making a new idea is not free. But this isn't actually the cost of filing for a patent. The idea is that you have to, it costs something to innovate. So it's not the patent filing that's costly, it's the actual innovation that's costly. So, I mean, it's a bit, I can see how you'd say that, and it's not, a terribly wrong answer, but that's what I'm sort of differentiating here is there's not like a decision you have to make about whether to file a patent, which is costly, or to just keep keep a corporate secret and just not tell anybody about it. That decision here isn't in the model. And then finally, inventors make a profit. Again, I can sort of see where you're going here. I might have been not super careful in the slides, but here the inventors are actually the R&D sector, right? So it's the R&D sector, which is not making any profit in this model that I'm calling inventors. So they don't actually make any profit. There's perfect competition in the R&D sector. So these were a bit tricky, these questions, and I can see how I could sort of snare you in each of these answers. They're not terribly wrong, but the best answer, I think, is blueprints are available to the public. Okay, fundamentally, why do we grant market power? Share surplus fairly with the inventor, market solutions are efficient, compensate the investor for costly effort, or leads to powerful innovations? Market power. Yeah, I like that people said it leads to powerful innovations. That's awesome. But yeah, so it's to compensate the investor for costly effort. So, or the inventor here. So, this is now stepping slightly outside of the model, since in the model, the R&D sector is perfect competition. But the idea here is that, it costs something to actually innovate. So if there's no market power, then there's no reason that you have to innovate. Right? You might as well just not innovate, because you're going to get zero. You're going to get zero profits from your innovation. So yeah. So that's that. Market distortion is bad. How else could we compensate inventors besides patents? Could we give prizes for necessary inventions? Maybe the government could buy inventions. We could have stronger laws against corporate espionage. Or we could actually just bring the innovation inside of the government. Yeah, so actually, these are all just ideas that some people have suggested. The government actually, I mean, there are actually some prizes for some things that people have done. bring innovation inside the government. Government buys inventions. These are all possibilities. Stronger laws against corporate espionage, maybe. These are all ideas that have been floated. There's an issue with all of these ideas, which I think I'm actually going to we'll talk about maybe after the Zoom, after the Kahoot. All right, technological progress is unstoppable, true or false? Okay, so I said false, and the reason why false is the right answer here is, think through the lens of our model, right? So what we said is people won't innovate unless they get this market power. So if we get rid of market power, at least we're going to slow down the pace of technological change. Okay, so let's finish the Kahoot and then talk about that a little bit. This point here, I'm not sure we're going to talk too much more about it, but I think it's an interesting sort of sociological phenomenon that we have. For some reason, people feel like technological progress is just this unstoppable force that's sort of outside of our control. And it's like, we're just going to have to deal with it. The robots are coming, the automation is coming, the autonomous driving, whatever, it's coming, and there's just nothing that can be done. But it's not true, right? We live in a society, we make sort of collective decisions about all sorts of things. And, in simple models like this, we can get that the decisions that we make in terms of legislation affect sort of how fast new ideas are created. So it's interesting to me that people think about technological progress as this unstoppable force of nature, where it doesn't seem that that's true to me. It seems like a policy variable rather than a force of nature. The social planner went. Oh, that's number 3. 3 is good. Okay. All right, that was nice. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. Where am I? Okay, so yeah, let's come back to the question that Krugman was asked on this podcast about whether the government should have a role in innovation or whether we should leave it up to the private sector. Now, maybe rather than, well, maybe sure, whatever, I'll ask, does anybody have a difference of opinion or a new idea maybe after doing that Kahoot? After our little discussion in the Kahoot?
All questions in this Kahoot were sort of indicating that if you don't give them any benefit of market power, they won't innovate. And we can sort of then argue that we need to incentivize somehow by either of those 4 things that you maybe gave.
Sure.
That they are going to innovate in like sectors where there's maybe not that much profit to gain, or I think that's also why they do it in the real world, right? Because if in some sectors it's just not that profitable to investigate new things, while in others it's much better. So that's why there's then some of these EU schemes to give money to maybe sustainable research and something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that that's right. And then even maybe one step farther than that, this whole thing is based on something that's basically a patent, right? It's based on a monopoly power that doesn't really come from anywhere except for legal documents written by a government regulator. So not only is the government involved in innovation already, but based on the ideas in this model, it's like a fundamental part of innovation policy. So, you could imagine some sort of libertarian world with free markets, perfectly functioning everything. It's missing this component. So at least based on this idea in this model, and I think an idea that is shared by many sort of economists that work on these issues, uh, government is an absolutely fundamental part of innovation in the world. So I don't know. So that's one thing. And then I think you can almost use that as sort of intuition to sort of think about the government's role in other sectors, even in the in other parts of the economy. Of course, you need something like competition policy, regulation of and things like that. Even contract enforcement. Um, you know, what we call the free market is a market that's based on rules and institutions. So, those rules are a very important part of the free market, and the enforcement of those rules is something that is done by governments. I guess maybe if you're a very strong libertarian, you might think of sort of market-based ways to do that, but it's hard to think about. It's hard to think about ways to do it that don't involve the government. So that's also, by the way, what Krugman said. Krugman said that not only is the government involved through patents, but all sorts of research that's now very valuable is actually based off of more fundamental research that is then funded more directly through government grants and the university system. So, yeah. Any comments on that spiel? Okay, so it's about time for a break. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then after that, let's come back and I'll ask if you have any more questions now about the Roma growth model. And then I didn't write out the plan today, but then I'll also talk about the first problem from the problems that you turned in yesterday. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break.
I think you're still muted.
Thanks. Before I turn to the question and answer session, there's a couple of things I recall that I wanted to mention. One of them is, I mean, so you might have seen my announcement from this morning earlier. So I'm actually organizing the European meeting of the Urban Economics Association this year, and it's a very large conference. It actually has 12 simultaneous sessions, which means that, and it runs for 3 days. So it means that there's 12 papers being presented for like 4 hours for 3 days. So that's like, almost 150 papers. And then there's people that attend and don't even present a paper, and there's discussants and things like that. So it's a very large conference, like with hundreds of urban economists from all over the world attending. And we need student assistants to help administer the Zoom rooms. So I put up a little ad. I think that you guys would be good candidates, because I think you are hopefully somewhat interested in economics, and this is sort of cutting edge research. So of course this is a paid job, and I strongly encourage you to apply if you're interested in maybe thinking about pursuing, say, a PhD, or if you are just interested in what academic economists are working on these days, especially in the area of urban economics, which thinks about things like, these days, I bet there's going to be a lot of papers on the following question, which is, as people begin to telecommute more, what's that going to do to the geography of cities? So, telecommuting isn't new. Telecommuting has been around since the early 2000s. My brother, he telecommuted from Seattle to Minneapolis. That's about maybe 3,000 kilometers for maybe 2 or 3 years. I know there's a lot of people that are doing that now because of course. So one question is, in the 1950s, I'm not quite sure why I'm describing this one thing in so much detail. Maybe it's just because I find it interesting. But in the 1950s, people moved out of cities to the suburbs. So the population of central Copenhagen, so that's Copenhagen municipality, it reached its highest point ever in 1960, I want to say. Might have been a little bit earlier, maybe 1950. And then the population of Copenhagen municipality dropped by 1/3 and hit its lowest point in about 1990. And it's been rising since, but it still hasn't reached the population level from 1960. So, it's a bit of a puzzle, because we know why people left in the 1950s and 60s. It's because people started buying their own cars. So it became more convenient to live in suburbs where you could get more space and then commute to work in central cities. That's not really a mystery. The mystery is more why, over the period of the rise of telecommuting, so say since the year 2000, or even a little bit earlier, say since 1990, center cities have actually been growing. And it's not just Copenhagen, it's all over the world. Manhattan, central Paris, etc. It's become easier and easier for you to not live exactly where you work, because you don't have to go into the office every day. And yet the center cities have been growing. So that's a bit of a puzzle. And because of COVID and because of the rise of telecommuting, and then now you've seen news articles about house prices in suburbs going up, and prices for rent, especially in central cities, being stagnant. I'm sure people will be talking about that. Interestingly, I don't know if you saw, but the Copenhagen center city housing market has been great. It hasn't, it's been, people were predicting last spring that there was going to be a drop in prices. That never happened. Actually, there was a rise. And then in the coming year, people are expecting there to be a humongous rise. There was an article in the newspaper this morning. I saw that the, the central bank of Denmark is predicting a 10% increase in property prices over the next year. So there you go. Okay, so that was my spiel about the job. Please do consider applying. It's going to be about 4 or 5 hours for those 3 days of the conference, kind of looking after the Zoom room, making sure the people are unmuted when they need to be and muted when they don't, and everybody has the right to share the screen. And of course, you get to hear the research without paying the conference fee. And in fact, we're even going to pay you. So yeah, if you're interested, just send me an email. You can read more on the job ad I sent. That was one thing. Another thing is I was going to talk about the other ideas that we saw on that one Kahoot question, right? About how we could encourage innovation other than patents. So, you know, prizes is one old idea that has been used. You know, the government could offer a prize for the first person to develop a COVID vaccine, for example. That would be one way of funding innovation. Another way would be for the government to directly innovate itself, right? So in a sense, you could think about universities which are run by the government, public universities. You know, University of Copenhagen would be an example, or DTU or Copenhagen Business School. You know, we're ultimately funded by taxpayers. So in a sense, our research is also public research. And then the other one, which I think is very provocative, is you could just have the same system we have now, but then the government could buy patents, right? I mean, why doesn't the government just buy a patent? Why are we creating this weird market distortion? It's kind of weird. Why doesn't the government just go in and buy the patent and then let whoever produces it produce it? It seems just better, doesn't it? Then we don't distort the market. Why don't they do that? That's actually an old idea from the 1990s, I think. You know, why doesn't the government just buy patents? So it turns out that especially the prize and the government buying patents, those two ideas, which are similar, they suffer from some problems. Okay, so in the idea of the prize, I think that you can probably guess the biggest problem is that it requires some committee to decide what is the direction, you know, that innovation, quote, should go, or like, you know, which direction will innovation go, or which direction do we want innovation in? And, you know, those sorts of prizes are going to have a hard time, they're going to have a hard time supporting things that you can't predict. So, you know, I don't know, Netflix or whatever, you know, I'm trying to think of recent innovations, you know, the iPhone or something like that, a smartphone, right? I mean, like I'm old enough to remember, I think I might have mentioned the time before smartphones. And I don't think it wasn't like an obvious idea that if you put a computer onto a phone size device, that's going to be, you know, a game changer. But I mean, look at smartphones now. So it's hard to imagine the government predicting these things. Of course, looking backwards, they all seem maybe more obvious, but if you were standing back then and thinking forward, it's harder to figure out what the next innovation is, or the right best innovation coming up next is going to be. So I think that's one issue with prizes. Sometimes you know what you want. So I think it was maybe Lasse was mentioning that in the EU they have prizes for sort of green innovation. I think that's right. So then, you know, maybe we have decided as a community that we want sort of certain types of innovation. So maybe that's okay. Another one. So the problem with buying a patent, that's also a problem because, you know, it's hard for anyone to know what the value of any particular innovation is. So, you know, when you buy a patent, you have to know the price of the patent. So the market sort of provides a natural price. You know, a patent is valuable when the technology is useful. You could think about it kind of that way. But you could imagine a world where we know the government is going to be buying patents, and then there's going to be a lot of arguments about the price, and you could imagine that the government would not be paying the right price for patents because of lobbying and other things like that. So I think, you know, the reason why the patent system is sort of a nice way of doing it is because it puts sort of a natural value on each patent. You know, you're only going to license a patent you can only charge a certain amount to people that want to license your patent, and that's sort of what the market will bear, right? So yeah, I think that there's those information problems. In the case of the prize, you have to know what's the next innovation. In the case of buying a patent, you have to know what's the value of this patent. And in the case of the bringing the innovation into the government, you face, again, sort of the question of what direction should we innovate in next. So, there is some logic behind the current system we have, even though it is very, very weird if you think about it, granting market power to companies. So yeah, I wanted to go on a little spiel about that. Anybody have any comments to add about that?
I mean, they don't really give prizes anymore, right? They rather give grants to like ideas, which then they give many to many different ideas and hope that one of them kind of works. So I think the prize thing is not really, maybe, at least not from the EU, right? They rather give like money to research ideas so they can hire people and actually start doing that.
Sure. I mean,
before even something is developed.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the university system, I guess. I'm applying for a grant right now for some new research. But yeah, I think that's right. We certainly have the Free Forskningsfond in Denmark, which provides tax money for research. Okay, cool. So I actually have one other thing I want to talk about, but it's not directly related to innovation. So I'm going to hold it till after we've done some more, done the standard stuff. And then afterwards, I'll see if anybody's interested in hearing about this thing. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see here. I'm just gonna share the slides. So I know I asked last time about questions, but does anybody have any more questions now about this endogenous growth model?
I have a question.
Go for it.
So in the very end, when you talk about the Nobel Prize, right? Kramer notes that there's a correlation between technological and population growth. And I'm not sure if this is like what he meant by the correlation, but I think you imply in a sense that it's like that technology drives population in some sense, but it seems weird in either case because you have like a plummeting population in Rome, which would imply like a backwards technology growth in that sense. So would that not be another support that, having more population enables higher technology growth, meaning that like you don't really need, or like technology doesn't facilitate population, but more like the other way around?
I mean, the way that I was thinking about it is the other way around, right? The idea is that once an idea exists, once there's already a better way to make a mousetrap, it's like that's out there. People can use that, and anybody that builds a mousetrap can make it in this better way. So the idea would be that the more people there are, the more ideas there are. And since ideas have this non-rival character, the faster will growth be. So I mean,
Okay.
The causality I'm thinking of is from more people, more ideas to more growth, not from more growth to more people.
Okay.
Necessarily. Although now that I said that, I guess maybe you could think that it could go the other way as well.
No. Okay. And then another question about the slides is on slide 22. The last equation sign comes from like some derivative or like inserting some expression for y0. I don't know if I missed it somewhere, but like, where do you get that expression from?
Boy, I haven't looked at this file. Let's see here. We have an A0.
if it's hard to find, then I can also ask on mail, and then you can write exactly where it's from. But it does.
But I mean,
this didn't seem
but I
intuitive.
mean, in principle, we have. Okay, wait a second. Let's think here. Y0, the amount we're producing at the beginning. We have an A0 here. Okay, so it's these two terms, right? So
Yeah.
this looks like the amount. Okay, so this looks like the amount of labor per per intermediate firm. And this would come in with the power. I mean, if we go back to the production function, where is it? So the amount of labor per firm is here. Each firm is going to have the same amount of labor. And then how many firms do we have? Well, it's 0 to A0. So you're going to multiply by A0. Yeah, I mean, it must come from here, right? So I mean, X is just the labor per firm. We know what that is. It's L minus LA divided by, L minus LA divided by A. That's the labor per firm. So that is X. And then you're just gonna, I think it's gonna come out of that. I'm a little bit nervous to start writing things down because I'm scared that I'm gonna make a mistake and make it more confusing, but we could try. Okay, so we wanna know what Y0 is. Okay, so we wanna know Y0. That's gonna be the integral from 0 to A0 x I phi di, then 1 over phi. Okay, but we know actually what the xi is for each firm since they're all exactly the same. So we can just write y0 is equal to, let's say, L minus, I think it's L bar minus LA divided by A0. That's the amount of production per firm to the power of phi. We have this integral from 0 to A0 di, and then this whole thing to the power 1 minus 1 over phi. Is this getting us closer? So then this thing is just going to be A0, right? So let's see here. Let's write it again over here now. Y0 is equal to L bar minus LA divided by A0. This whole thing to the power phi. Then here we're going to have an A0 hanging out. And then this whole thing to the power 1 over phi. All right, does that get us there? Okay, so here we're going to have a 1 minus phi. So it's going to be A0 to the power 1 minus phi divided by phi. And then times L bar minus LA. Take the log Y0 is equal to log of L bar minus LA plus 1 minus phi divided by phi times log A0. That must be it, right? That looks pretty close to what we have down there in that last slide.
Yeah, but we need to divide by L bar in the L bar expression.
Yeah, but did that come from here? Or did that come from something else down there? Let's take a look. I'm going to flip
Oh
here
yeah,
and then.
I see.
Yeah, okay. So I think that's where it comes from.
Yeah, because. Okay, great. Thanks.
Sure, no worries. Any other questions? Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I
a
have
big
one.
that's a big skip step. That was a big skipped step, so that was a good point to point out. Yes, Kari?
It's on in the video when you're on. Sorry. It's slide 16.
Do you want me to pull up the video?
something? You write something and it doesn't show on the video,
Oh, okay. Let's see.
and I'm very angry about it
Okay.
because
Let's
I
figure
hate
it
this
out.
video because the sound is disgusting.
But didn't you look at the I attached that new sound file, and actually I thought it was much better.
Yeah, but I'm always stopping the video and then playing it again, and I couldn't have like two sources pausing and playing.
So I spent some
Your
time on
solution
it.
wasn't the solution.
So the reason why I couldn't just attach that sound to the video is because, of course, I cut out all these little pauses. So the sound was shorter. Okay. So I could have sort of lengthened it to match the length of the video. But the reason that didn't work is that the gaps in the sound aren't evenly distributed across the video. So when I lengthen it, then the part that I'm talking about doesn't match the part in the video. So yeah, at some point maybe I should consider re-recording that one. But that's such a good video. I feel so bad about it. Okay, so anyway, it's your Jenkins. I'm on my private account here.
So it's 1 hour 9 minutes or something like that.
Okay. Here. Is it this slide? Is this what you mean?
Yeah. Then you write something beneath what you've written in the bottom, and it gets cut out.
Wage grows at the same rate as output. Final sector pays all revenues to intermediate sector. Constant markup implies fixed revenue fraction paid to workers. Okay. So this is saying that wage is a fixed share of revenue, right? That's what this says. Final sector pays all revenues to intermediate sector. So therefore, the wage is growing at the same rate as output. Yeah. I'm not sure what I wrote, but do you understand what the implication is here? So what I'm saying here is that I want to show that wages in the economy are growing at the same rate as output is growing in the economy. So what I'm saying here is that everything that's made by the final sector, which of course is the same as there's no saving in this model. So everything that the workers make is being paid, or I should say everything that's being consumed, everything that's being produced is consumed. And, the price is all paid to the final sector. Since the final sector has zero profits, everything that's made by the final sector is passed on to the intermediate sector. Okay. And then we have to worry a little bit because the intermediate sector is different, right? Some of it's going to the workers and some of it's going to the owners of intermediate sector companies. Okay. So, it's not direct that wages are going to grow at the same rate as output because, there's some split there. There's some split of of the output between the workers and the owners of the intermediate companies because there's profits there. Okay. So what I'm trying to show in these 2 bullet points is that the wages actually are growing at the same rate as output. So the argument for that is that this constant markup that we have in the model, it's going to imply that a constant share of of the revenue of the intermediate firms is going to be paid to the workers. So it's always going to be a constant split. Okay, so then if it's always a constant split between, what the owners are making and what the workers are making, then if the revenues are growing at a certain rate, then those two parts of the split are also growing at the same rate. Okay, so that's the argument I'm trying to make. And I'm making a claim here. I'm saying that this constant markup implies that a fixed revenue fraction is being paid to the workers, but you don't have to believe me, right? So I'm trying to prove it to you that that statement is true. How do I do that? It's actually very simple. I say that in this model, we've shown that the price is going to be this markup, 1 divided by phi times wages. Okay, so that's what I mean by a constant markup. Phi is constant. Okay, just rearranging that equation, you're going to get that the wage is phi times the price. Okay, so that's constant. And then let's multiply both sides by Q, by the quantity produced. And what we get is that the payments to workers is just a phi share of the revenues of the firm. So in other words, the payments to workers is a constant share of the revenues. So if the revenues are growing at a constant rate, then the payments to the workers are also growing at a constant rate. Okay, so I'm not quite sure what I wrote below that, but that's the point of this slide.
Great, thank you.
Sure, no worries. Other questions? No? Okay. So luckily the question that I'm going to go over today is one that I've assigned in the past. So to avoid the fiasco that happened last time we met, I have my cheat sheet, which is my solutions from last time. So let me pull that up. I wrote them really nicely. So I'm not sure, I can kind of rewrite these if you want. But I could also just go through it using this solution, which is what I think I'm going to do, unless you guys really want me to rewrite the solutions again. I'll post this, by the way. Okay, so to remind you, let's look at the problem. So I want to go to Canvas. Actually, let me just find it on my own. Okay. Okay. So problem 211 is about the Ramsey growth model. And it says, consider the policy described in problem 210. I'll briefly mention what that is. I think I sent you the problem. Basically, there's going to be a tax on capital, on returns to capital, actually. So suppose that instead of announcing and implementing the tax at time 0, the government announces at time 0 that at some later time, T1, that's when the investment income will be taxed. Okay. Let me pull up this problem 210 here, and I'll show you the only important part from the problem of 210. So I'm going to turn, actually, will this work now? Let me turn off my video thing. The reason I have a video thing on is because my wife is at home and she's walking around behind me. So I'm trying to be polite. Turn off my virtual background here. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this, but on 210, really the only important thing is this formula right here. It says that the interest rate that the households care about, the one that the households are facing, is going to be 1 minus tau times f prime of little k. Okay, so that's really the policy, is that. So what's the problem here? What is the actual problem we need to solve? It's draw the phase diagram, okay? And then answer the question, can C discontinuously change at time t1, why or why not? That's kind of hand wavy. And then draw the phase diagram of the dynamics of C and K before t1, after t1, etc. So we're actually going to kind of answer all of those by sort of drawing phase diagrams. So let me now switch to my solutions here. Oops, I forgot the windows. You can see everything at the same time. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this. So these first two equations are just directly from our discussion in the text. And you'll recall we have sort of two equations. One of them governs the change in consumption over time. Okay, and then this is important. This comes from the consumer's problem, ultimately, where we have the interest rate that consumers face is right here, where I've written f prime of little k. And you'll recall that this, this now combines both the consumers and the firm's problem, because the interest rate we've derived from the firm's problem is the marginal product of capital, or in this case, f prime of little k. Okay, so this is kind of a combination, but for the most part, we derived this equation from the consumer's problem. And then this equation up here, this is the evolution of capital. And this is more just like a fundamental part of how physical capital evolves. Okay, so you'll recall the change in little k, it's going to be basically investment, so that's production minus consumption, that's like investment, and then we subtract off this term, which is our break-even level of investment, since the population is growing and then the level of technology is growing. So since little k is capital divided by effective human capital, or physical capital divided by human capital, if we want little k to be constant, we have to sort of correct for the fact that in the next period, if you like the continuous model, but in the next period, there's going to be more human capital. Okay, so basically investment minus this correction term. Okay, so those are the two sort of fundamental models we use to draw this phase diagram. And you'll recall the way this phase diagram works is we set these left-hand sides to 0. And you'll see that if we set this left-hand side to 0, if we just say that there's no growth in consumption, we can sort of solve for this little k, or implicitly we can solve for this little k. It's going to be some level where consumption doesn't change. Okay, these things are all just parameters. So it doesn't depend on the level of consumption. The speed does. There's a c down here in the bottom, but if there's no growth, since the numerator here, c dot is 0, then that's just going to be some fixed level of little k. Okay. Up here, because we're gonna set little k dot to 0, we're going to put this c on the left-hand side, and now you're going to see that there's actually a relationship here between the level of little k and the level of c. It's only a pair of those that delivers no change in little k. And that makes sense, right? Because these two together determine investment, and then this one here determines sort of break-even investment. So you need both. Okay, so that's why we have this sort of hump shape. Okay, and if you recall, we can also sort of sign the direction that the level of capital is moving in these various quadrants, and the level of consumption is moving in these various quadrants. In particular, in this area of the graph, consumption is growing and capital is falling. In this area of the graph, capital is growing, consumption is falling. Here we have both growing, and here we have both falling. Okay, so that's just kind of a review of what this figure means. Okay. Now, this is our situation at time t0 before the tax is implemented. But then at time t1, when the tax is implemented, we're going to have a different situation. So I've been emphasizing that this bottom equation is derived from the consumer's problem. So what the consumer cares about is what is the rate of return that they can get. Okay, so if the government is taxing investments on capital, then what matters for the consumer is going to be the ex post rate of return, right? So what do they get after the government has taken away the taxes? So that's going to be 1 minus tau times sort of the rental rate of capital that the firm has to pay. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing because, you know, when there wasn't any tax, we could talk about, you know, the rental rate and the interest rate, and they were the same. Now there's a little bit of a gap because what the firms are willing to pay, which is the marginal productivity of capital, that's not actually what the consumers get. They get that minus the taxes they have to pay to the government. Okay, so that's why this 1 minus tau appears here, and that's why the f prime of little k appears here. This is like the rental rate that the firms are paying, and then these two things together is the actual interest rate that the consumers get, okay, on their investments, if you like. One other important thing to say, and this is often true in this textbook, the government is just a total a-hole because what they do is they take whatever tax revenue they get and they just throw it into the ocean. So, I mean, you know, you have to keep in mind when you're reading this book that that's kind of how they treat government expenditures. They're not useful, right? So, I mean, are taxes bad? Well, almost by definition, if you put them into the model this way, because all the tax is doing is taking something that was useful. It was being produced, it was being consumed. It was something that, you know, people were getting something out of, and you're taking it and destroying it. So of course the answer is going to be, the best answer is going to be, I should say, the, you know, welfare, utility, whatever maximizing level of taxation is going to be 0, because all the taxes do is just destroy things. Okay, so you know, keep that in mind. You don't want to think about this as making a statement about what is sort of the best optimal taxation policy, because we're not really giving it a fair shake. It's more, how does sort of a distortion in the market affect the evolution of capital or evolution of consumption. Okay, that's the way you want to think about this. Okay, so look at these equations.
Sorry, about the government. Is that one of the reasons why we didn't go into the chapter about the government in the model?
You mean within one of the chapters we've covered?
Yes, like yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's,
that's the government in one of them, and you didn't touch on it at all.
That's right.
That just because government spends money.
So the one I know that I deliberately skipped the government is when they talk about the real business cycle. I think it's there. But maybe it was in one of the earlier models. But yeah, there's some. Oh yeah, here they have it though. So here they have in the real business cycle model, I know they have the effect of the changes in government purchases, but government purchases here again are just buying something and destroying it. So, you know, it's not really, I don't find it particularly illuminating. And I feel like there's sort of a political message in it that I don't like, because I think it's not because I always think that government spending is good, but because I think they're not being fair in the way they think about government spending here. If you want to think about it that way, right? Another way to think about it is simply suppose that agents in the model are facing some sort of distortion, and, you know, how is their behavior going to change? Then I think it's okay, as long as we're careful to remember that we're not going to think about this as a way to think about whether government spending is good or bad. But that was a long answer to a short question. Yes, I often skip the part.
Yeah, so I opened the book, and it's chapter 2.7, the effects of government purchases.
Yeah, that sounds like the kind of thing that I would probably skip. Let's see if that is right.
Okay.
Is it true that they just throw it into the ocean? Yeah, it is, right? If you look at the equation 2.41, I know most of you can't see this. I'll show you on the Zoom. But if you look at this equation, get it in focus. That's not, you're not going to be able to read that really. But okay, so you can see this is our equation for the evolution of capital. And usually we have production minus consumption, and then that correction term, like I have on the slides. Now we have an additional term, that's government purchases. But all this government is doing is taking some of the capital and throwing it into the ocean. Okay, so it's like, it's just kind of, it's just doesn't, I just don't like the way the government is introduced there. So that is correct. That is why I didn't cover that part. Because it's just like there's some capital monster that takes something useful in the economy and destroys it. You know, that's a very unusual model of the government that I don't really like. So yeah, that's why I didn't cover it. But thank you for pointing that out, Kari. I'd forgotten about that because I've been doing this for so many years that I'm not putting my nose into the text every time I review the slides to teach them again. Okay, but anyway, yeah, so that was a lot about that. But anyway, the point here is that now we're going to have sort of a new function here. And if you think about how this function, if we set this left-hand side to 0, and we need to solve for the level of capital that's going to solve this equation, you're going to find out that we need to have less capital. And that makes sense. Why is that? Because we know that this f prime of k, when k is smaller, this thing is bigger, right? We have this concave production function. So when we have less capital, we're going to be more steep, right? It's flatter on the top and steeper on the bottom. So since we've got this number here that's less than 1, we made this whole thing smaller. How are we going to sort of get back to the level that's going to deliver 0? Well, the way we're going to do that is to make this term bigger. How do we do that? We make little k smaller. Okay. So long story short, this yellow line here is going to be shifted to the left, and it's going to become this red line. Okay. So one of the questions that I think part A of this question says, how do the dynamics of this model look when we have after T1, when the tax is implemented? Well, then it's going to be just what we talked about in the class, which is there's going to be some saddle path, right? Something like that. And wherever you are, suppose we start with this level of capital, we're going to jump to this point on the saddle path, this level of consumption, and then we're going to kind of slowly move down to the steady state. Okay. All right, so that's part A. And you can see that I've sort of drawn that over here. Okay, part B says, can consumption jump discontinuously at time T1? Okay, and the answer there is no, and this is a bit hand-wavy, but the reason why is because, you know, I have to be a bit careful. You know, this here is formally a differential equation, because this thing's changing with time, and the change is going to change discontinuously, but the level of consumption is not. And the reason why that is sort of a hand-wavy thing about how people don't want to have their marginal utility jump. You know, they want to smooth their consumption over time, simply because they don't want to have one instant where they have a very low marginal utility and the next instant where they have a very high marginal utility. I think that we can make that argument more formal using something like an Euler equation. But you know, for the purposes of this question, I think it's okay just to say that that people would like, in this model, would like to smooth their consumption. And then if you like, you can give a counterexample where if there's a big jump in marginal utility, you can improve the total amount of utility by transferring some of the consumption from the low marginal utility period to the high marginal utility period. But for the purposes of this question, I'm just going to answer people in this model smooth consumption, so they will not accept discontinuous jumps that are predictable. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say. And then for the next one, I think they say, so what's going to happen? Suppose we're sitting here at steady state. Okay. And then suddenly the government announces, starting at time T1, we are going to implement tax. Okay. So what people are going to do is they want to make sure that their consumption is not discontinuous. Okay. So, you're sitting at this level of capital. You can't change that. In the short run, you can't change little k. So you have to choose some points for consumption along this line. Okay. So what you can do is, let's take a look over here. It's kind of small. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. I should probably get rid of my annotation. Okay, you're going to work backwards. So starting at time T1, we know that the way this economy is going to adjust is going to simply be along this saddle path. We take that as given. Okay, so at time T1, we are going to be on the saddle path. Wherever we are, our consumption is going to jump so that it's on that saddle path. Okay, we don't want to jump. All right, so we're at time T0. So we have to think to ourselves, what level of consumption can I jump to now so that at time T1, I'm going to have smooth consumption? And it turns out it's going to be something like this. So you recall at time T0, let me just say one more thing here. At time T0, this area looks like this. Okay. So what happens is we're going to choose some level of consumption so that we end up on the saddle path and we won't have a discontinuous jump for this expected change in the tax rate at time T1. So we're going to kind of go like this. So we start here. We're in the steady state at time T0. Suddenly the government announces, we're going to start taxing at time T1. Our consumption jumps up to this point, and it keeps going up, actually. Our level of capital goes down until this is now time T1. Now we're going to follow the saddle path down to the new steady state. Okay. So I believe so that's A through C in that problem. And then D, in light of your answers to parts A, B, and C, what must C do at time 0? Okay, we already said that. It's going to jump, right? So, I mean, if you expect there's going to be a change in taxes, then there's not going to be any jump in consumption at that moment, So I expect that in the future there's going to be a change in taxes. I want to smooth my consumption through that expected change. But if there's an unexpected change, then I can have a jump because I wasn't doing the thing that was optimal, before, because I didn't know there was going to be this change in taxes. So in light of these answers, at time 0, consumption is going to jump. And then summarize your results by sketching the paths of C and K as functions of time. Okay, so I've got that here as well. Okay, so here's before time 0. Let's look at consumption first. Before time 0, we're in our steady state, everything's going fine. And then suddenly at time 0, the government says, hey, starting at time 1, we're going to implement this new tax. Okay, our consumption immediately jumps up. Okay. Intuitively, why is it jumping up? It's because we know that with the tax, the new equilibrium or the steady state level of little k is going to be lower. Okay, so we need to consume more to get rid of some of our little k. So our consumption jumps up, and then as you saw, it keeps rising. Just going to go back here to the left a little bit. It keeps rising. Consumption's going up until T1, and then consumption starts slowly falling until we get down to our new steady state. Okay, so that's jump up at T0, rise up to T1, and then fall down to the new steady state. And then actually you can see consumption at the new steady state is lower than consumption was at the original steady state. That makes sense because we're going farther away from the golden rule level of capital in this model. Okay. All right, what's going on with little k? I just barely have this in the screen here so you can see. Well, little k, capital is a stock variable, so that can't change discontinuously ever. No matter what I do today, the capital stock is the capital stock today. Okay. Consumption can change, right? I can change how much I consume, but the stock of capital is sort of fixed in the short run, in the very short run. So at time zero, there's no discontinuity, but you can see here that we're moving to the left. Okay, so over time, we sort of go down until T1 happens, and then we go down even farther to our new steady state. Okay, so that's it for that question. Any questions before? The next one's very closely related, so they're almost a pair that goes together. So let me just mention what's happening here. Okay, so using the phase diagram to analyze the impact of unanticipated and anticipated temporary changes. So here's some variations in problem 2.11. All I'm going to do is just redraw the phase diagram and then sort of talk a little bit about how things are going to change in terms of the paths of consumption and capital. So now it's going to be somewhat complicated. At time zero, the government announces it's going to tax investment income at rate tau from time zero until time 1. So we're going to immediately implement the tax, but we're going to stop taxing you at time 1. Okay. So that's the problem. So let's look at that one first. Okay. So again, we have these two lines. So here's the original sort of situation in the economy. Remember that when we implement the tax, we're going to shift this C dot equals 0 line to the left. Okay. So now what is the government doing? Recall, they say, okay, we're going to immediately implement the tax. It's a surprise. So, so we're going to do that until time 1, and then we're going to go back to our original situation. So what's important to see here is that ultimately, we're going to go back to this long run steady state where the saddle path looks like this. Okay. So at time 1, people in the economy now want to be on this saddle path. Okay. So they're going to work backward to say, what level of consumption can I have today so that at time T1, I'm going to be back on the saddle path back to the long run steady state. Okay. So, it's kind of interesting, right? What happens when we shift this line to the left, suddenly this area here, it becomes an area that shifts down and to the left, right? Before we had shifted, this was an area that went left and up. But once this line shifts to the left, now this area goes left and down, okay? So what happens is you need to increase your consumption so that you ultimately kind of fall down to this point. If you didn't change your consumption here, if you didn't change your consumption, you would start moving to the left. Well, anyway, you wouldn't hit the right spot. So, yeah. Yeah, you just end up somewhere down here. So anyway, that's kind of the point. You have to shift your consumption up so that you end up hitting at time T1 this saddle path that's going to take you back to the long run steady state. Okay. So how does that look? Here we have a jump in our consumption, and then we're going to have a fall in consumption and continue to fall until time T1, and that's the lowest point of our consumption. And then we're going to have a rise again up to the long run steady state, which should be at exactly the same level. I didn't draw it well, but it should be exactly the same level as the original steady state. Okay. What happens to capital? Something similar, right? So our capital, of course, doesn't change discontinuously because it can't. But we're going to have lower and lower capital stock moving to the left up to some point before T1, and then our capital stock is going to grow, and continue growing back until we get back to our long run steady state. So you can see we bottom out our capital stock before we get to T1, right, at this point here. And that's it. So let's go to the last one. It's again, just another variation. At time 0, the government announces that not now, but at time T1, we're going to implement the tax, and we're going to keep implementing it up to time 2, and then we're going to get rid of it. Okay. So let's see how that one looks. Well, again, we have these same 2 lines, and we have the same logic. So what happens is, the long run, after T2, we're going to be back on this steady state saddle path here. Okay, so we're going to work backwards. From time T1 to time T2, this C.0 line is going to shift to the left. So so in this area, we're going to be going down to the right. In this area, we're going to be going down. Oh, wait a second now. In this area, we're going to be going down to the left. In this area, we're going to be going down to the right. So working backwards, this is now from T1 to T2. Starting on the saddle path, we want to see where we're going to end up here. And then now from time T0 to time T1, we want to end up back where we start. So in this period, to the left of this line, we're going up and to the left. So anyway, yeah, it's just kind of working backwards. We want to have our consumption at this level. Okay, so now, just to draw again one more time, how's this going to work? From time T0 to T1, our consumption is going to jump. So we're sitting here at T0. Suddenly the government announces this weird policy. So from T0 to T1, we're going to go up here. Okay. Now it's time T1. From T1 to T2, we're going to be going down this direction. And then here's at T2. Now we're back on the long run saddle path, and we're going to go back up to our long run steady state. Okay, so the whole point is we want to end up here. So we need to work backwards. How can we end up there without having any discontinuity after this initial jump? Okay. If we look at our paths of these variables through time, I apparently didn't draw one for consumption here. Not sure why not. But anyway, if we were to draw one for consumption, you can see that consumption, let's just draw one quickly. Okay, so we have T0, T1, T2. Okay, so this is consumption now. Make it a medium level, I guess. So before T0, we're at our steady state level. Suddenly we're going to have a jump. And then actually we're going to have our consumption go up until T1. And then at T1, it's going to start falling. It's going to fall below our initial level until T2. And then we're going to have a return to our long run steady state level of consumption. Okay. And then with a little k here, of course, again, can't have any discontinuous jump. So you can see here, though, that we're always moving to the left up until sometime between T1 and T2. So we're always falling until sometime between T1 and T2. This is where we hit our minimum level of capital. And then after that, it's going to rise. It's going to start moving to it's going to start rising up until we get back to our original level, our original steady state level. So that's that. Any questions about that? The reason I'm assigning this one, I think one of the questions in your, one of the course objectives is something about graphing. And, these are really good exam questions to say, when do we introduce the tax, draw the phase diagram. So this would be something that I would recommend reviewing. And I'll post this, these solutions. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna go through today. I'll go through the next one next week. We'll do one problem each week. Something. Oh, I was gonna say one more thing. This is somewhat related actually to what we were talking about earlier. During the break, I was reading the Frederiksberg Blad, newspaper, local newspaper in Frederiksberg. All politics is local politics, as you know. So I saw something interesting here. I thought it would be fun to discuss. See if I can find it again. Ah, this guy right here. All right. So this guy, I don't know who he is, but he's apparently well known in Frederiksberg, and you Danish might need a review, so I'll just tell you what it says here. But this guy, whoever it is, Jens Ringgaard Christensen, says, "Mit beste klimaråd er maksimalt at få 2 børn." So he's saying, my best advice for climate change is that you don't have more than 2 children. So I thought that advice was interesting. I've heard it before. So, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to talk about there. So the first one is related to our discussion earlier. So maybe I should, before just kind of saying my thoughts, maybe I should, how many people do we have left here? Still a few, great. Maybe I could ask you guys your thoughts. Anybody have any thought about that? Best climate advice is maximum 2 children?
I think this is one of the worst advice you could give.
Why do you say that?
I think it's the path of least resistance. And I think the best climate change path is like all of us going vegan forever. Like, or, you know.
But how many of us?
Like all.
But how many in the future, right? I mean, how many children should we have?
Forever. Oh yeah, I don't care about children as long as we all do the other thing.
Okay. Yeah. So you're saying it's an easy way out.
Yeah, the children thing is an easy way out, and it's like a cop out. You know, it's the just do that now. Just have 2 children. Yeah, and just like it will fix itself in like 50 years. And in the meantime, you know, we get growth rate that isn't like at a level we don't need and stuff. I'm saying we could reach a better potential of the human society if we all just go vegan, and I don't know.
So so you know, you could in a sense fix it if everyone had 0 children.
Yeah, that's the other equilibrium point, that 0.
But I mean, you know, it's related, right? Because I mean, I think that when you're thinking about, you know, what kind of society we want in the future, you know, it's a little bit weird to think about the climate, like, you know, climate change without thinking about people. Because I mean, sometimes I think people have this idea of the climate and it's something that's sort of independent to people. But when we talk about sort of the harm of climate change, you know, I think that we mean the harm on people. If there were no people, then who cares? So, yeah, I think it's interesting. That's one thing. The other thing I was kind of hinting at is based on our discussion today about the endogenous growth model. We saw, one of you, I think, asked about, I think it was Kai asked about the relationship between the population and ideas. So, you know, if you ask me, you know, ideas are a super scarce resource, and the more people there are, the more ideas there are. That's a good thing. That's one thing. And then the other thing is, you know, each person, as long as they have a life that's worth living, it seems like adding people, you know, ex ante is sort of a good thing if you're a utilitarian. The more people, the more that, you know, the more nice lives worth living. That's a good thing. So so yeah, I see I'm now losing people, and I also think that I'm actually over time. So I won't go on here, but I think that that's interesting, controversial statement, and I think it has something to do with our discussion today of the growth model. But anyway, yeah, this was good. So next time we're actually going to.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Can I ask you about the job? Is it just a glorified IT position? Like
Well,
economics.
in a sense, yes, but my job is like a glorified, conference administrator. So I mean,
Yeah.
it is. It's
I mean, I
nothing.
get why you talk about your job, but
But it's true. It's going to be basically, the actual job is watching the Zoom room while the presentations are going on, and making sure that people don't unmute themselves or whatever when they're not supposed to, or making sure the time is kept to. But I guess the advantage for people like you and like people in this program is that, mostly it's going to be sitting and listening to people present new economics research. But the actual job is basically the IT administration of the Zoom room.
great, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so just to put one final word on it before I let you go. So next time we're actually really shifting gears a lot. So far we've talked about economic growth from various points of view, capital accumulation, different generations. We've talked about endogenous growth, how our ideas created. Next, we're going to be focusing on another big area in macroeconomics, which is the business cycle. So if you think about the business cycle, with the economic growth, I said, how big is the cake, right? How do we make the cake grow? The business cycle says, I have some ingredients. Today I baked the cake and I got twice as much cake as I got yesterday. Tomorrow I put the same ingredients in and I got half as much. What is going on? Our technology didn't change. We have the same amount of labor. We have the same amount of capital. How could it possibly be that from one day to another, we get a different amount of output? That seems crazy. So not only is that something interesting to study theoretically, but also practically what's happened for the last 50 years, 50, 100 years, is that governments have really given economists a lot of power in deciding sort of how to smooth out these fluctuations in cake amounts over time. So there's a lot of thinking about that. And yeah, so basically the rest of the course until we get to the international macro is going to be about the business cycle. So real business cycle is what we're going to talk about next week. And
so it's the RBC videos?
It's the RBC videos, yeah.
All of them, I guess.
Yeah, how many? Maybe I should look at my syllabus. Did I allocate one?
These are 10 videos at least.
Yeah. The question is, how many days are we going to talk about it? Let's see. Yeah, I only have one day, so it's going to be, yeah, it's next week, all of the RBC videos. Okay. Cool. So I will see you then. Thanks. Bye.